Today, we are unpacking a case that is just deeply tragic and honestly incredibly sensationalized. We're talking about the 1996 disappearance of journalist Susan Walsh. It's one of those cases that completely gripped the media over 2 decades ago and plastered the front pages everywhere. But as you're gonna see, those wild headlines, they only captured a tiny fraction of the actual truth.
I mean, think about it. What actually happens when a journalist who is actively investigating underground vampires and the Russian mob just vanishes into thin air? I know, right? It sounds exactly like the pitch for a Hollywood thriller. It perfectly fits that gritty 90s mystery vibe that everybody loved. But the reality behind all that sensationalism is far more complex. It's much more sobering, because at its core, this is fundamentally a story about a very vulnerable human being who was completely, totally failed by the system. So here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the timeline of the vanishing journalist. Then we'll dive into the vampires and the mob, uncover the real woman behind the story, examine the prevailing theories, and finally, look at how this cold case is actually being rekindled today. Let's just jump right in. Part 1. The Vanishing Journalist. Okay, let's start with the timeline. It's July 16th, 1996, in the quiet, suburban town of Nutley, New Jersey. And it starts in a remarkably mundane way. It's a sweltering summer day, hitting 90 degrees. Around noon, Susan leaves the apartment complex she shares with her 12-year-old son, David. She tells her estranged husband, Mark, who actually lived right downstairs, that she's just running across the street to use a payphone and she'll be back in half an hour. By 12:45 p.m., her son and her roommate, Christian, finish watching a movie, but Susan isn't back. The real turning point hits at 3:30 p.m. A friend comes over and finds the apartment door locked shut, which is super weird because they usually left it wide open. Susan had just vanished, and she left behind her son, her wallet, her ID, and her pager. Literally everything she needed for her daily life was sitting right there in that apartment. Moving on to part 2, vampires and the mob. To understand why this story absolutely exploded in the global media, you have to look at the intense undercover work she was doing for the Village Voice. Susan was simultaneously navigating 2 massive shadowy subcultures. On one side, you have the Russian Mafia. Susan was using her connections as an exotic dancer to expose how mobsters in Brighton Beach were forcing young immigrant women into the sex industry. This was seriously high-stakes, dangerous journalism. But on the flip side, she was also deeply embedded in La Commedia del Sangue, which was an underground, self-proclaimed vampire community in New York City. She even dated a guy who believed he was an actual vampire. Her editors ended up rejecting that vampire piece because they felt she lost her objectivity, but the point is, both of these investigations plunged her deep into secretive and honestly incredibly hostile worlds. And you know, that kind of deep immersion took a massive toll on her psyche. After her Russian mob article got all this critical praise, she became incredibly paranoid. She started telling friends she genuinely believed she was being stalked by dangerous people. She was getting threats, both veiled and explicit. The fear was real. In fact, there's this documentary called Stripped, shot literally 2 days before she disappeared, where Susan casually mentions on camera that she has a stalker. She even went and filed a restraining order against an obsessive ex-boyfriend shortly before she vanished. So she absolutely believed her life was in imminent danger. Which brings us to part 3, the woman behind the story. Because beneath all those crazy headlines about mob hits and vampire cults, there was a very real, struggling human being carrying an impossibly heavy load. Susan's life was full of intense contrasts. She wasn't just some journalist chasing a gritty story. She was a brilliant master's student in English at NYU and a fiercely devoted mother just trying to make ends meet. To pay her tuition and support her son, she worked intermittently as an exotic dancer. But she was also battling bipolar disorder, and she had recently stopped taking her prescribed medication. And tragically, after holding down an impressive 11 years of sobriety, she had relapsed into drug and alcohol abuse right before she vanished, specifically mixing alcohol with prescription sedatives like Xanax. You add that to her failing physical health, like severe ulcers and emphysema, and you're looking at a perfect storm of absolute vulnerability. Her friends and colleagues literally said she was barely hanging on. Her editor at the Village Voice, James Ridgway, noted that she had recently been hospitalized. He even saw that her wrists were bandaged at a publishing party, which heavily points to a possible suicide attempt or severe self-harm. Plus, she was having these severe, erratic mood swings. Guys, she was a woman in deep crisis, desperately trying to juggle motherhood, grad school, and dangerous investigative reporting, all while her internal world was just crumbling apart. All right, part 4.
examining the theories. So what actually happened to Susan Walsh after she walked out into that 90-degree heat? Investigators and true crime folks have debated this for decades. Let's weigh the options here. First up, the mob hit theory. The evidence? Well, she had real threats and escalating paranoia. But the evidence against it is huge. There's literally zero physical proof or a crime scene. Next, the vampire cult. The media ate this up, but almost everyone agrees her involvement, while totally bizarre, had no actual evidence of a murder plot. Then we have the overdose or accident theory. Honestly, the evidence here is incredibly strong. You've got the severe relapse, her failing physical health, and that highly erratic mental state on the day she disappeared. The only thing working against it? Her body has never been found. And finally, the runaway theory. But as her best friends pointed out, she left her beloved kid, her wallet, and her pager behind. That is definitely not the meticulous planning of someone starting a brand new life. Now, despite how wildly unlikely that runaway theory is, get this. Detective John Ryan of the Nutley police actually went on record at the time saying, "I believe Susan Walsh is alive. She opted to leave her family and home." The authorities adopted this dismissive stance almost immediately. Because of her highly publicized struggles with addiction and her work as an exotic dancer, the official attitude seemed to just be, oh, she abandoned her kid to go back to the streets. The investigation lost steam so incredibly fast because they just assumed her disappearance was a choice rather than a tragedy. And that brings us to part 5, a cold case rekindled. Because decades later, that exact dismissive attitude from the police became the catalyst for a brand new fight for the truth. In 2020, journalist Arwa Mahdawi started looking deeply into this case and found a glaring systemic issue: misogyny in reporting. She realized the 90s media and police response was just absolutely drenched in sexism. The cops and the reporters focused way too much on her work as an exotic dancer, essentially victim-blaming her and dismissing her worth. Instead of treating her like a highly vulnerable missing person who deserved a relentless search, they used her lifestyle as an excuse to just look the other way. It's a pretty stark reminder of how societal bias can literally derail justice. Backed by the Fund for Investigative Journalism, Mahdawi didn't just write a retrospective think piece. She actually fought a grueling 2-year legal battle against the town of Nutley to unseal the original police records. 2 years! When a judge finally forced them to release the documents, Mahdawi dug through that heavily guarded material, interviewed key sources, and shined a completely new light on the systemic failures of this cold case. And you know what? That incredible push for transparency worked. It forced the police to formally start reinvestigating the case, and it even sparked a brand new CBS documentary that brought Susan's story to a whole new generation. It has been 29 years since Susan Walsh vanished. Almost 3 decades of agonizing silence for her family. And while her body still hasn't been found, the push for transparency and for treating her memory with the basic human dignity she was denied back in 1996 is stronger than it's ever been. We are finally seeing the narrative shift from cheap sensationalism to actual accountability. Which brings us to one final, really tough question. Did the media's absolute obsession with vampires and mobsters actually help cover up the reality of what happened to Susan Walsh? Ultimately, we have to ask ourselves if that sensationalized focus on underground subcultures distracted us and the authorities from the tragic human realities of addiction, mental health, and systemic bias that truly defined her final days. It completely shifts how you look at true crime, doesn't it? And it leaves you wondering how many other victims have been lost behind the headlines.